Start here 11, the Age of Enlightenment, when Europeans finally stopped being racist because of the Bible and started using science as an excuse instead. We've all heard by now that history didn't start on October 7th, but if it didn't, then how far back should we go to get context for the beginning of modern Zionism? I don't particularly like pointing to a definitive beginning of things because everything comes from something else, but I think that if you wanted to get the proper context for the beginning of modern Zionism, the movement to build a Jewish nation state, a pretty good start would be the Age of Enlightenment in 1700s Europe. This movement, among other things, signified a switch from traditional, often divine authority structures to a focus on reason, science, and individualism, constitutional governments, and the separation of church and state. During this time, new nation states declared independence from empire, be it militant colonial settlers in Turtle Island or hungry people in France. A domino effect of revolutionary fervor swept the globe. In places like Latin America, Haiti, Greece, and many others where you might say nation building became a national pastime. Thus began a gradual yet inexorable shift towards a world political structure defined by sovereign entities that were both nation and state. Populations united not just by shared culture, history, or heritage, but by clearly defined borders and sets of laws that, to whatever extent, protected the people within them. And in the midst of all this global upheaval came the Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah. Drawing from a long tradition of rationalization as self-protection, this movement advocated against Jewish reclusiveness in Europe. It encouraged things like adopting fashionable attire over traditional dress and worked to diminish traditional Jewish authority structures like the rabbinic courts and boards of elders. Haskalah also eventually served as a basis for both Zionist and anti-Zionist movements. Take, for example, the concerted effort during the Haskalah to revitalize Hebrew as a literary language. Years later, the staunchly Zionist Eliezer Ben Yehuda would use that work to revive the language entirely because, to build a nation state, one must have a national language. As My Jewish Learning puts it, for Ben Yehuda, nationalism became a way to embrace Hebrew without religion. In other words, he was a nationalist but not religious Jew. Certainly by the end of the 1800s, the Zionist movement went about creating their national identity as so many others had before them. They began constructing a new history and set of traditions and symbolism based in large part on the secularization of various religious Jewish texts and traditions. See, at the time, there was a broader post-Enlightenment shift occurring globally, which romanticized agrarian lifestyles. This was seen as a kind of counterpoint to urbanization, advocating for values such as self-reliance, physical strength, and communal life, which were perceived to undermine modernity and the pressures of assimilation. This then, of course, manifested in the establishment of kibbutzim and moshavim in first Ottoman and then British Mandate Palestine. Like Ben Yehuda, they believed themselves to hold Jewishness as an ethnic identity, not as a religious one. They suppressed Yiddish and Ladino and outspokenly derided traditionalists. Just as an example, Max Nordau, who is often called Theodor Herzl's right-hand man, wrote extensively about his hatred for his fellow Jew, particularly Eastern European Jews. This was encapsulated in his horrific ideology called Muskeljudentum, or muscle Jewry. This emphasized leaving behind the weak, persecuted, feminine Jew of the past to make way for the new, physically strong Jew that works the land and fights against his persecutors, an ideological predecessor of the inherent misogyny of modern Zionism through militancy and the overall concept of sabra. Jewish opposition to Zionism arose almost immediately through both adherence to tradition and in the decision to embrace change in tradition. The schism was viewed as a result of external influences, with the creation of movements such as Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative. Early Reform movements, in no uncertain terms, were staunchly opposed to Zionism. They almost universally viewed it as a blight to be stopped, a conviction which did not waver until 1937. Jewish orthodoxy varied, but by and large, Hasidim were opposed to Zionism and many remain so to this day, as does the vitriol toward them among Israelis, except of course in instances of convenient tokenization. They are still often seen as a continuance of the backwards, primitive, or weak stereotype, as my friend Rudele puts it. This self-cannibalizing lens is a necessity for the success of Zionism, but anti-Zionism flourished in both religious and secular Jewish spaces, with Jews taking up arms against the idea that the Jew must be removed from anywhere in order for both the world and Jews to thrive. By nearly all accounts, Zionist settlers were problematic from the very beginning, perhaps the inevitable entitlement of European colonizers anywhere, or possibly due to some deeper and more tragic weaponization of past trauma. Ahad Ha'am, a liberal Russian Jewish intellectual who visited Palestine in 1891, published a series of articles in the Hebrew periodical Hamelitz that were sharply critical of the ethno-supremacy of political Zionism. He railed against the exploitation of Palestinian peasantry by Zionist settler colonists and drew attention to the fact that Palestine was not an empty territory and that the presence of another people on the land posed catastrophic problems to the intended nation state. According to him, the Zionist pioneers believed, quote, "The only language that the Arabs understand is that of force. They behave towards the Arabs with hostility and cruelty, trespass unjustly upon their boundaries, beat them shamefully without reason, and even brag about it. And nobody stands to check this contemptible and dangerous tendency." And it bears repeating, that was from 1891 Ottoman Palestine. His suggestion for why such behavior ran rampant among Zionist colonists was that this hatred of the native Palestinians stemmed from their anger towards those who reminded them that there is still another people in their supposed land of Israel who have always been living there and do not intend to leave. In other words, the indigenous, already successfully agrarian Palestinians were met with immediate resentment by the European settlers for the mere audacity of existence, of inconveniently living connected to the land that certain secular Jewish intelligentsia had so thoroughly decided should be theirs. To their growing horror, a nation already existed connected to the land where they wished to build theirs. As such, founding Zionist figures like Max Nordau somewhat paradoxically took to painting the Palestinians as yet another example of the backwards, primitive, feminine Oriental. As Robert S. Wistrich writes, "Not for a moment could Nordau, the great critic of European decadence, envisage an orientalization of the Zionist project. Modern anti-Semitism might have transformed Jews into Orientals or Asiatic strangers in Europe, but in the Middle East, they were expected by Nordau to be fully fledged Europeans. Their task was to push forward the moral frontiers of Europe to the Euphrates. In this Eurocentric colonial vision, Zionism would be performing a civilizing mission in Asia Minor, similar to that of the British in India." In short, not only was Zionism self-described as a colonial project, but as a vehemently secular European one. Fueled by manifest destiny, motivated in part by a hatred not just for the native indigenous inhabitants of Palestine, but for everyone who disagreed with their political movement, including and especially those from within their own community who rejected proposals for Jewish identity as in any way colonialist or nationalist. I'm Paul Nabil, Syrian American, and this was Start Here Part 11. Thanks especially to my friend Rudule, who helped research and frankly write several parts of this post. Consider checking them out and giving them a follow. Next up, let's create a nation state.